I'm here because of a lot of adults who didn't have to, chose not to see me as other, but chose to see me as of, and to look past this too energetic, kind of angry, kind of pushy young adolescent and see the human being underneath. There is a profound shift in perspective that's being asked of our city governments, of our county and state governments, from seeing ourselves as managing public resources to seeing ourselves as engaging community in conversations about those resources, because that's not authentic engagement. And we have a parallel set of processes called focus groups, right? We get the data and then nobody ever hears from us again because the data isn't for them. This isn't a real engagement process.
I think we can get a quick behavior change, but it doesn't get a substantive change in the hearts and mindsets and systems that we need change to have something meaningful and sustainable.
There's an implicit culture of blame that unfolds. And the first step for us is to stop that story and to own that whatever the reality is, right, however powerful, however supportive, however toxic and tragic, we have co-created that, and it's going to take.
There is no growth in comfort and no comfort in growth. Yet the big leaps are how careers are made and how businesses excel. So how do you master not knowing at all or feeling like an imposter? How do you have the conversations that lead to trust and, of course, excellence? How do you take charge of the things that you can control? How do you thrive outside your comfort zone? That's what this podcast is about. I'm your host, Wanda Wallace, and it's time to get out of your comfort zone. Welcome to the conversation. So today I want to talk about change yet again. One of the major things we have to do and lead as leaders, as someone once said to me, if you're not leading change, I don't know what you're leading. But it's awfully easy to talk about and extremely difficult to do it. So I want to explore a little bit about what else we need to be thinking about. And this, what we're going to talk about today, is going to apply as much to work in the community, to the social systems, the political systems, as well as to the world of work. I think it's pretty universally true about any place where you want to be part of driving sustainable change. Now, the problem that I find, and that my guest today finds, is that too often we're incredibly well-intentioned, but we approach change with too narrow of an understanding of what it really takes to achieve and sustain meaningful change. Meaning, I think we can get a quick behavior change, but it doesn't get a substantive change in the hearts and mindsets and systems that we need change to have something meaningful and sustainable. So what we're going to talk about today is, what is it you need to know to really lead sustained change? Who do you need to get involved? Why, when, how? And we're going to talk about some real success stories and the insights from years of organizing for sustained impact. So my guest today is John Ott. I must say John has been a guest in the past, and we're back for a repeat conversation, one of a handful of people, I might add. And John and I have the pleasure of going back many, many years. Thankfully, it's a delight in my life as well. So John is a co-founder of the Center for Collective Wisdom. Some of the results from C4CW's partners that they have held themselves accountable for include things like assuring that all children enter kindergarten healthy and ready to succeed in school and life, ending chronic homelessness, and yes, it is possible, ensuring every young person graduates high school with a path, a plan, and a purpose, promoting health and healing and well-being for all community members. That's just to scratch the surface of what I know some of the work has done at the Center for Collective Wisdom. Early in his career, John founded and led several nonprofit organizations. He's worked in many communities as a community organizer. He was a faculty member and co-founder of the leadership program at Duke University, the author of 2 books and 1 forthcoming book, The Power of Collective Wisdom and The Trap of Collective Folly, which I love, thank you very much, Centered on the Edge, and upcoming soon is The Living Collective Wisdom. Now, I have to say, John's life's work has been inspired by his experiences of being homeless for much of his adolescence. And that is a whole other story in of itself. John, welcome to the podcast.
Always a delight to spend time with you, Wanda. Looking forward to the conversation.
Likewise, me too. All right, John, I always like to start with the why question because I'm infinitely curious about what brings people to the work and to the questions that they ask about that work. So why? What got you started in this kind of work?
Cool. Well, You really began to speak to it, Wanda. My orientation to change and to community really began with my experience of homelessness. My mom grew up in the foster care system in Houston, and like many women of her age and generation, she had experienced profound trauma and didn't know how to seek help, and so self-medicated through addiction and alcoholism for much of her life, and she suffered with depression. So growing up, there was enormous amount of chaos in my life, and mom and I ultimately became homeless just before I began ninth grade, and that continued some with her and some after she had left on my own until I could finally figure out how to lie about my age and get a job. Why I start with that story is because though I didn't have this language at the time, that experience helped me understand the power of community. Because I'm here sitting with you today, privileged to do the work that I do in communities around the country and beyond, because of a lot of adults who didn't have to, chose not to see me as other, but chose to see me as of, and to look past this too energetic, kind of angry, kind of pushy young adolescent and see the human being underneath. And it was really that experience of community and being loved by folks who didn't have to that drove me to do the work that I do.
Wow. First off, wow. I know that story, but that's still an incredible story. And for the record, you know, John, but for everybody listening, one of my passions is around helping homeless people have a sustained life. And the reason is because it passes trauma down to the kids. And many of them are not fortunate enough to be in communities that can embrace them, pick them up, forgive them, kind of move them along. So that's powerful work. All right. So I know you from our days together at Duke University, and I know your passion about organizing a topic at the time very few people were focusing on, the migrant population, as a starting point. And you've gone on to do a whole bunch of other things since then. Of all the things that I know you've done, what's the one that is the most powerful, still resonates with you, that has formed your work at C4CW?
Well, there are way too many stories for the time that we have in this conversation. But I think I'll describe one right now, because particularly given what's happening through the federal government, what's happening at state governments and with foundations across this country and certainly the world, a lot of folks right now are experiencing profound budget cuts, reductions that they hadn't planned for. And one of the early large-scale systems changes that Rose and I helped lead was within the Los Angeles County Department of Mental Health. And in 2003, the department was looking at a projected $100 million shortfall. Quite unexpectedly, this was happening because there were a lot of changes inside of federal funding programs. There was also some significant changes within county and state programs as well. And the Department of Public Social Services within LA County just the year before had experienced a similar budget shortfall that led the Board of Supervisors to ultimately make wholesale changes in the senior leadership of that department. The Department of Mental Health wanted to avoid that result if possible, and so they took an extraordinary step of risking, rather than having to try to manage their way through this budget shortfall, they took an extraordinary step of inviting us to help construct a stakeholder process that would bring nonprofit leaders, folks with lived experience, parents and family members of folks with lived experience, government, county government leaders, and others into a process in which we wrestled with what the budget shortfall was, and more importantly, how the department should address it. And quite remarkably, we were able to achieve consensus on a set of recommendations among these stakeholders about how to resolve this budget shortfall. And those recommendations were ultimately embraced by a 5-0 vote by the Board of Supervisors, which in LA County rarely happens, right? And that work and that experience actually helped inspire similar stakeholder efforts around the state when the Mental Health Services Act was passed a year later, and there were now new resources available. So I can unpack that story further if you wish, but that's the story that stays with me, in part because a lot of folks right now across the country and elsewhere are really fearful of profound reductions in the resources they have available to them. And what I want to say is, even in those moments, it's possible for folks to come together, reach agreement, and actually improve results, even as we're experiencing those shortfalls.
All right. So I know that the hallmark of your work has been about bringing a broad range of voices together. It's kind of where you started with your own story, that being of the community and not an individual or a family or a saving thing, but the community as a whole embracing you. And you take that same community whole out to the work that you do. And I think that's what makes it remarkable. So as I've listened to you talk, you always talk about bringing people together I would never think should come together to solve a budget crisis in a Department of Mental Health. People who have been served and families of people who have been served, and many more constituents. Say a little bit more about why you believe all those voices are essential.
You bet. So, and I think, Wanda, particularly in this country in these times, given the polarization that we're experiencing, I think there is a profound shift in perspective that's being asked for of our city governments, of our county and state governments. And this has equal implications for the private sector that I can talk about in a moment. But that shift is from seeing ourselves as managing public resources to seeing ourselves as engaging community in conversations about those resources. Whereas one of the fundamental shifts that's happened in our country over the past 30 to 40 years is that folks have lost sight of the reality that taxes are nothing more than our commitment to ourselves for how we want to support priorities for the folks in our communities, right? And so in a lot of contexts in the public sector, we have very passionate leaders, very passionate managers who got into this work because they cared and wanted to make change. But the mental model is, we're the managers, we know what we're doing, trust us to take care of this. And in the example that I told with the Department of Mental Health, that was not going to fly. And the reason was not because the leadership within the department was not trusted, it's because there were so many conflicting interests around what should be prioritized within that budget that had the leadership tried to manage their way through this, they would have been attacked incessantly by folks who were going to be disappointed. So instead, we created a process that had folks hold the complexity and the contradictions and the differences together. And as a consequence, the recommendations that came out received no critique by folks who were used to seeing each other as enemies, seeing each other as competitors. Instead, they had been of the process, helped reach the recommendations. And the Board of Supervisors, of course, was going to say yes to that.
Well, we ask, I'm going to move to organizational life for a moment. Using your example, we ask people all the time to accept our judgment about compromises. We all know that there's inevitable compromises on time, on attention, on budget resources, on resource allocation, a whole bunch of things. We cannot do it all in our communities, in our government, or in our organizations. And we ask people to just accept our judgment. without ever taking them through the process of understanding the very real complex trade-offs that are required. And I contend even a senior group of leaders don't often understand themselves all the complexity of the trade-offs that they're now discussing. So this notion of bringing a broader group with you on the journey of understanding the trade-offs, being informed about them, being able to make smart choices about them, seems to me the only way you ever get buy-in in that famous organizational word.
I entirely agree. And particularly in this economy, and given what we saw around the great resignations after COVID, far more private sector organizations and public sector organizations are having to take seriously culture in addition to results, right? We describe our work at the center as working at the intersection of culture, leadership, and strategy. And for us, building successful culture means that folks are engaged in decisions that affect them. And when we're talking about a multinational corporation of hundreds of thousands of employees, or a Department of Mental Health of 10,000 or more employees and contractors, it's not possible, of course, to engage all folks in every decision, nor would you ever want to. But it is possible to build processes that have folks recognize themselves in it, and to trust that their perspective is being engaged and heard because they know the folks who are at the table on their behalf, right? And for me, there's a lot of conversation now in philanthropy and public sector work, I know in the private sector as well, around transparency. But transparency only has value if I trust you. If I don't trust you, if I don't feel I'm of, then you can be as transparent as you wish, but I'm still not going to accept the choice, right? Or accept the decision and its impact on me.
Yeah. Right. I will think, what have you not been transparent with me about? I'm going to second guess that. And I'll say, even if that is how you see the world, it isn't how it works for me. And off we go to every subversive thing that has ever happened, probably anywhere in the history of humankind. Okay. So I personally see and believe that if you don't engage all the different voices, perspectives, that are going to be dramatically affected by something that you're about to do, then you will not have buy-in. Mm-hmm. You may have coercion, you may have compliance, you may have people eventually get along, but boy, do we waste a lot of time in the process, okay? The classic standard at the moment is, particularly with an incoming new CEO, to do a listening tour. 30, 60 days, there are all sorts of forums created. Usually the CEO isn't in every one of those forums because that's unrealistic. Tell us what you think needs to change. Tell us what you think are the big themes, blah, 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 all rolled up, et cetera, et cetera. Why doesn't that work? Because it doesn't.
Correct. Because that's not authentic engagement, right? And we have a parallel set of processes that unfold in the public and nonprofit and philanthropic sectors called focus groups, right? Where at various times, folks will go out often asking the very same questions that were asked 6 months ago or a year ago or 2 years ago by somebody,
5 years ago, yeah.
by somebody else. And we get the data, and then nobody ever hears from us again because the data isn't for them. This isn't a real engagement process. This is us getting information that we're going to take back and make decisions on your behalf, right? It's often similar within a listening tour, even when the intentions are good. And I want to be clear, often the listening tour is an authentic expression of a desire to hear. But too often, particularly when it's a change in senior leadership, folks don't want to really talk about the pain or the wounding that may have resulted from the previous senior leadership being removed or leaving, or what had happened prior. And so it's like folks who are having listening tours, but it's only tell me about this point forward. Don't want to really hear about back what happened because that wasn't us. We didn't do that, right? And the second challenge is that we never hear back from that listening tour unless it's through an email or some kind of broad communication, and it doesn't lead to changes in authentic engagement, right? So over time, particularly if I've been in the company for a number of years and I've gone through 3 or 4 of these,
Yeah, here we go. Here we go again. Yeah.
right.
Well, where I see this happen, so I will give CEOs genuine intent. I will also give them honesty that they can't be in every one of the meetings that need to happen. Okay. Their representatives could be. All right, fine. And most organizations will roll that up to some big abstract statement where it's hard to recognize what it was I said and what I'm worried about in that big abstract statement. And we weren't engaged as employees in the trade-offs that get to that big abstract statement. So, okay, either, yeah, that sounds good, or no. I mean, I'm thinking about one company where there was a digital revolution thing that was part of we need a digital revolution. Okay, great. Now that you've decided we needed that, I'm waiting for you to tell me what it is you want me to do about that.
Mm-hmm.
Good luck. Because the trade-offs, the engagement, the hard work was not part of the discussion.
That's right. Moreover, more often than not, whatever that statement is, the only way that statement has meaning is if we manage to it going forward. My experience is that, particularly in the focus group process that I was describing in the public sector or in these listening campaigns within the private sector, it results in a statement, but there's no managing to it. So there's no ongoing reflection about how are we living this statement? What are the implications for the day-to-day responsibilities that I have as a mid-level manager, as a line worker, right? Where are we seeing the gap between the statement and our lived reality, and how are we evolving as a company or as a community to shift and to narrow that gap, right? So it's done as a performative exercise more often than not, even when the intentions are good. And unless we are continuing to sustain engagement and reflection and adaptation, it'll just be seen as a rhetorical exercise.
It was a rhetorical exercise. That probably cost the company 2, maybe 3 or 4, maybe longer years of productivity. But at any rate, I won't criticize them too much. And while I put this at the feet of the CEO or the new CEO, I think this happens all the time at every management group in most organizations. And again, because of great intentions, just this lack of understanding of what it means to truly sustain engagement, to inform people about the trade-offs, and to have their voices adequately represented. I mean, those are the pieces that I come back to. All right, which begs the question, John, how? So I get that I need all of these people from very different walks of life with competing points of view, don't necessarily like each other, to come together and how do I navigate? Like, that feels like that takes forever. And how is anybody supposed to navigate that?
Yeah. So when you figure that out, Wanda, let me know. I'll offer a response to that, but I want to come back just momentarily to the why question, because we have some experience in the private sector, but much more our experiences in the public sector with philanthropy and community. And the why of the processes that I have been describing, that I'll talk more about in just a moment, isn't just about getting buy-in, though that's important. It's also that we don't have the answer as senior leaders, as managers. The senior leadership within LADMH literally did not know how. They could have made, if it was an issue of simple math, they could have, of course, gotten the budget to balance. But the question is, how do we evolve the system in a way that actually may at least sustain, if not improve, outcomes while we're absorbing this budget shortfall? When we're talking about chronic homelessness, ensuring every child enters kindergarten healthy and ready to succeed, these are big questions, and no one has the answer, right? If we did, we'd already be seeing sustained results, right? So The why of this starts with us recognizing that as leaders, as managers, as community representatives, we don't have the answer and we need other perspectives for us to discover together what's going to work. So if we have that why, and I start there because the how only makes sense if we have sufficient why, because if we're already getting the results we hope for, if this is really just about buy-in so folks don't rebel, we're not going to undertake the work that it's going to take to do real engagement of folks, right? So if we have this why, if we're clear there's an aspiration that's deep in our hearts and we're not seeing the results we hope for, now we can talk about the how.
Okay.
And yeah, please.
Before you do that, I just want to underscore how important that is, because there are problems and there are problems in organizational life of any form. There are problems where we just need to dig a little deeper on. There are problems when we kind of already know how to do it. We just have to get disciplined about it. There are problems where everything is running smoothly. Don't mess it up. Put a Band-Aid, keep going. And there are problems when we genuinely don't know the path forward. And it's not because we haven't tried. It's not because it's brand new. It's we've tried and we don't know. And it's that latter category that you're really focusing on. And I think that's an important distinction. Tried and don't know.
That's exactly right, Wanda. We don't need to engage everyone if the question is, where are we going to go for lunch?
Some groups that might not be true with, but okay.
All right. But it is exactly right. When we've tried things, when we thought we had the answer, we've done a lot of things and we're still not getting the results, or the world has changed and what was working before COVID isn't working now, post-COVID, right? So from that place, there are a number of hows, and I will say, we've developed a whole framework that we call Living Collective Wisdom that teaches commitments and practices that we have found have been really impactful in complex contexts when folks are wrestling with how do we get better results. And this, of course, is not capital T, the answer, right? It's not the way, but it is a way that we have found across a whole lot of contexts: rural communities, urban settings, huge public sector systems, small nonprofit organizations, and others, to get real results and to be able to sustain them over time. And a first step is for whomever is beginning to convene this process, that they tap into the why, right? And one of the things that we encourage folks to do very early is first to take seriously their aspirations, because so often when folks have been in systems or change efforts or communities or even businesses for a long time, that over time they've just accommodated, right? They've kind of oriented to the way things are, and they've lost touch with what really drove them to move into the work that they're doing. So one of the first things we do individually and collectively is we help folks tap into the power and to the depth of their aspiration. And then over time, we work to create safe space where folks are starting to let themselves feel and acknowledge the gap between their aspiration and the current reality that is. And again, in a lot of communities and public sector systems, folks are so used to having data weaponized against them that there's a lot of dissembling that can happen, where everyone has a sense that this is not working, but we don't have straight up conversations about it because we're afraid of what will happen to us if we do. And so one of the first things we do is we work to help folks tap into their highest aspirations. And then over time, in ways that I'll describe in a little bit, we help folks move more deeply into experiencing the depth and the reality of the gap. But the only way we can do that, Wanda, is if first, individually and collectively, we can embrace not knowing, right? so that we're not coming into this process. We have perspectives, but we're not coming into this process trying to harangue other folks to agree with us, right? That's not the spirit of this inquiry and process. The second thing that we do is that we also invite folks into some deep practices of self-leadership, including discovering those moments and times when I'm going to have a very hard time embracing not knowing, when I get attached to my story and I'm trying to harangue other folks to agree with it, as opposed to being open to the perspective of others. And in that stakeholder process I described with you, for you within LADMH, one of the ways, so we did a lot of small group work with stakeholders before folks came together. And when folks came together, we had them have to make a recommendation. If they were going to make a recommendation about a cut, they had to describe why. So they couldn't just say, we shouldn't cut here. They had to say, we have to cut here, and here's why of that. And that forced folks to be transparent about the positions they were holding. But because everyone was doing that, and as you might expect, in the first part of the process, folks basically said, "Don't cut me," right?
Right.
Yeah, right.
The rest of you, yes.
The rest of you, right? But often those conversations happen behind closed doors, and then it's up to the managers to figure it out. In this process, folks heard from each other. And then, and this was the big thing, they had to recognize that they needed each other. And so moving from a place of just advocating for my own position and self-interest, I had to be open to strengthening the relationship with you, and for us to figure out together with the 25 other stakeholder groups in the room, how we're going to do this together in a way that keeps us together. And that ultimately requires a process of individual and collective maturation, right? Change at the depth that we're talking about here isn't just something we manage. It's something that comes through us, and it requires us growing up and being willing to face our own shadow and our own dark spots and our own blind spots with other folks.
Oh, that's a lot, John.
Mm-hmm.
It makes me understand why we shortcut change all the time.
That's
okay.
Right.
So let me see if I can summarize. I doubt it. But if you think about this as a problem where we've tried multiple solutions, it's not working, and we're now willing to admit we don't know. So I'm willing to engage with a broader range of people than I might have initially thought about engaging with. And I'm willing to say, I don't know. I don't have the answer. I may have a piece of information, but I don't have the answer. Okay? And then what we have to do is, as individual leaders, tap into why. What's our aspiration here? What's at stake? What's the risk? What's the opportunity? And I will give you opportunity as a much more appeal than it is the risk, but okay, there we go. And then 2, I have to begin to acknowledge the big gap between my aspirations and where we really are today. And I think you're right. We learned to get along. We just learned that's how it is. Oh, well, that's how we work around here. Yeah, it is inefficient or whatever. And you're asking people to really admit how inefficient it is, or whatever the topic is. All right. Then as an individual, I have to be willing to claim what it is I believe and entertain the possibility that I might be not fully accurate, perhaps even wrong, certainly missed part of the story.
You bet. And I will say to our listeners who may think that you're out of your mind, or there has to be something more concrete. There are concrete commitments and practices that we teach to help folks do this, but without the why of this, right? So I want to tell another story very quickly to illustrate this. We were doing work in the Central Valley in California, and in this county, Stanislaus County, it's a very interesting county, about 530 to 600,000 folks. quite diverse. And the senior political leadership are typically Republican. Were part of the Tea Party movement in the late 2000s through, and now many folks who are avid supporters of President Trump. We also have folks who have been working with Latino families, promotoras, and others, families who have just moved to the county. There's a diverse set of economic interests there, from almond growers to folks who are working with migrant workers and lots of folks in between. And I'm simplifying this context, but just giving folks a sense of the spectrum here. There was senior leadership in the county who really got clear that they wanted to move the county beyond just funding responses to symptoms to actually funding real long-term solutions, because there was an enormous amount of strife and distress in the county. When we first brought a group of county leaders together, we had faith leaders in the room, we had senior political leaders in the room, we had folks who were working with promoters in the room, we had United Way, school district folks, neighborhood leaders, and others. Folks were not used to being in the same room together, and when they were often at odds with one another, or fighting over a particular issue or another. And we invited folks to begin to speak to why they had said yes to this invitation from the county CEO. And what emerged out of this first conversation, Wanda, and this moment will stay with me forever, that person after person, regardless of ideology, regardless of political affiliation, regardless of economic status, what folks were speaking to was how brokenhearted they were that their children were leaving the county and not coming back. And they so wanted the county to be a place where their children and their grandchildren wanted to be. And as different folks gave voice to this story, you could just see hearts opening. And this wasn't just the board of supervisor that I'd been fighting with the day before. This was someone who was deeply moved by a desire to make this place a place that we all wanted to live, right? So now it took a year of work for us to get to a place where that space became possible, right? We didn't just say, hey, come to a meeting, right?
Yeah, right.
No.
We're here for the following. Everybody clear? Good. Let's get started. Okay.
Right. Let's pray. Let's have our hearts broken now. Right. It took work to build the space for that moment to arise, but that moment has now spurred, over the next 10 years, an enormous amount of change in organizing in that county.
So this is down to understanding the human side of each different constituency that's represented, which is the human person, human concerns, ambitions, but it's also recognizing that they have a legitimate beef about something that maybe we are to think about.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a piece of this of recognizing somewhere in here through this whole process that whether we like it or not, we're all in this game together.
You bet.
Which strikes me as easy to say and extremely difficult to get to. Because I can imagine a number of places would say, we may be all in this together, but I'd be a whole lot better off if you'd just leave while we're at it. That exists in corporations too. Let me be really clear.
You bet. So, one of these steps toward individual and collective maturation that we talk about, Wanda, is a recognition that all reality is co-created. Right. The reality that I'm inhabiting, I have helped create. Right. Now, for those of us who've experienced real oppression, right, real violence done toward us, that can be a very hard statement. And I want to be clear, I'm not suggesting that we have earned or we deserve the violence or the oppression that has come toward us. but our response to it continues to unfold the reality, right? And we have the capacity to choose our response, right? So as we, so much of our political culture now, and I see this happening in private sector systems too, particularly as they get larger, is that there's an implicit culture of blame that unfolds, right? And the first step for us is to stop that story, right? And to own that whatever the reality is, right? However powerful, however supportive, however toxic and tragic, we have co-created that, and it's going to take all of us to help transform that.
Yeah. That one is a hard one to swallow.
You bet.
I can do this on a small scale as I think about times that I get called in to navigate a conflict between two team members. Okay, this is small scale. I got two people. I might have two managers involved in this and an ecosystem around each person, but ultimately it comes down to two players. And the story with each player is each has concocted a story of why the other one is fundamentally mistaken, misguided, misinformed, whatever it is, and in some lovely, sophisticated, nice ways, but it still is. They're the one that is at fault and they need to change. And in that work, the breakthrough comes in getting them to hear each other's frustrations and stories without that blame attached. If you can get there, the solution, I swear to you, comes in 15 minutes.
Absolutely right.
But it can be hours to get to that. And it's harder than anybody gives credit for. And I can't imagine doing that when there are 25 constituents. And in the constituent groups, it's not a uniform story either. So
that's exactly right. But let's keep it at that level, because I agree, for folks who aren't used to kind of large scale change contexts, 200, 300 people in a room that's just impossible, much less a county of 530,000 people, right? But let's start with the two folks, because the shift that has to happen in the process that you're describing is, first, they have to want to be there. And often they're having to be there because HR or somebody has said, this has to stop, right? So you have to be there. But even if they can acknowledge that, okay, I'm making a choice to be here, they have to open their hearts and their being enough to hear the story of the other person, right? And to be able to recognize each other as somebody they want to be in relationship with, at least to get work done, right? Don't have to be best friends, but at least to get work done. One of the commitments that we talk about, which can seem so trivial when we first say it, is one of the commitments of self-leadership is strengthen relationships, right? But what we mean by that is we need to commit to strengthen relationships, particularly when there's divergence between us, particularly when there's conflict or there's real difference. And that work becomes more possible if I see my relationship with you as essential to my success, to the success of what we're trying to create. Right. That's true for you folks. And it's true for as the processes get much larger.
Right. Yeah. Too often, I think we believe that we can take action to either ignore the person, work around them, ignore them, or to effectively push them out.
Yeah.
Now, most folks will say, no, I don't do that. I don't think but we do in very sophisticated, well-intentioned ways, take actions that, I don't know if they're the right person for this or whatever.
Yeah.
And sometimes that's true, but that's,
Well, yes, it may be true that someone needs to lead the organization, but the more important question is, what is their behavior or what's the dynamic that's emerging pointing to? Right. We worked with another behavioral health system over a number of years. And when they first brought us in, they had fired the last 4 executive directors before declaring bankruptcy, right? Yes. 1, bad hire, right? 2, bad luck. 4, there's something
something else.
And to the board's credit, they invited us to spend some time trying to discern what was going on. And what we discovered was that over time, folks had developed very different understandings of what this system was about. And the board kept thinking that if they just got the right person in the position, right, all would be well, right? 4 firings later in a bankruptcy, they finally said, maybe there's something else beyond here. And we were able to discover what that was. And through a process of collective healing and creation, that system has now not just come out of bankruptcy, but is thriving with a whole different vision and mission for how they engage the community.
Right. And hopefully not 4 more executive directors.
Precisely right. Precisely right.
It's I just want to speak to one of my favorite topics, and certainly part of the focus on this podcast is I fundamentally believe that expertise drives us to separation, not to coming together. Because let's say I'm an engineer, I have a whole understanding of how a product or a service or a machine or a technology or whatever works. And you want to make a change, but you don't understand how this works, and that won't work. Okay? And there's an inability to talk across lines of expertise because there's a belief that you can't possibly understand what I see because you don't have the depth of experience that I see. And that kills collaboration in more ways than you can imagine, even on problems that are not as difficult as the ones we've been talking about. But I just want to highlight how much expertise gets in the way. And even when we bring a project team together to solve an intractable problem, people come from a base of expertise and they come to that meeting with a belief that I have the answer and it is X. And that's exactly to where you start with a group work to say we're here because X doesn't actually work.
Well, yes. And the next layer underneath that, Wanda, is for me to honor the expertise that I hold, but to recognize and to admit first to myself that my expertise is not sufficient for us to solve or to make progress or to achieve the result that we hope for. But that can be terrifying, particularly for folks, not just who have spent years developing expertise, which is essential, but when our identities become wrapped up in the understanding that I am expert, the first commitment we invite folks to make is embrace not knowing. And for leaders and for folks whose identity is really entwined with their expertise, that can be terrifying. It's a little, what do you mean I don't know? They pay me to know.
No, right, right.
And it's not that we're not valuing the knowledge you have. It's that it's necessary, but not sufficient for us to make the progress we hope for. Even that small step can be terrible. And we often spend a lot of time in one-on-one sessions and coaching and other supports to help folks start to begin to see themselves beyond the expertise and the capacity they have so they can show up more fully as human beings in service of making progress that we hope for.
Right, right. I see that in so many leaders who love being the hero. They don't like that language. But what they like to do is to have people bring them problems and they have the solution to the problems. Put that leader up against a problem they don't know how to solve, have tried and failed on solving. And there's a huge question about identity and value. Why am I here? Am I good enough? That comes to the fore immediately. Well, John, and we haven't even scratched the surface on the tools that you use to keep these discussions evolving. But I think you have done a really good job of talking about the personal work that's required to be able to address, make progress against a really intractable problem. And I know we've talked about this in terms of budget cuts, but I'd invite anybody in an organizational life to say just how really effective is your use of AI, for example. Do you really know what the best path forward is? And if you embraced, we don't know, what would happen then? I would invite, if you say, yeah, these are the processes we use to do risk assessment, and yeah, it takes a century and maybe it cuts off some business. Are you really are you really admitting the gap between your aspirations and where you are in reality? I think there's so many small ways in which what you talk about comes to bear. And for those, I'm going to make we've talked about this, John, I'll make my one plea around the world, for that matter, in whatever social system that you're living in, where you feel like there's an other over there that has got something right or wrong or whatever. I invite you just to entertain the gap between where you think you are today and the reality of where you are, like your aspiration of what you'd like your society to be and where you are. I think if we did that, especially in the US, I think we'd see a lot more approach to change that made a lot of sense. But there's my political statement, and I'm not on a political agenda, and I also think it applies around the world in absolutely every place. John, what have we missed that's important? Other than 5 hours of conversation.
Exactly. Really, I have appreciated this exploration. I do think, just come back to that last point that you were emphasizing for a moment, Wanda, rather than stating something new. I think part of the question why we have folks really tap into the longing that they have, their aspirations, and the gap, is we have seen time and again when folks can really let themselves feel that gap and feel the longing. I'm willing to do the work of building relationships with folks I would rather not, right? Because the pain of what I'm experiencing in terms of that gap is greater than the discomfort or my desire to hold on to my story about why this person deserves what they're getting or an idiot or not seen right. So, particularly in communities, but also in large organizations, we need one another. And the question is, what can help us take the risk of building relationships across boundaries and stop the dynamic of othering? And that's really the invitation that the center is extending and what Living Collective Wisdom helps us embody.
Right. John, on that one, I can't do a better summary than that. What powerful work. All right, my guest today, John Ott. The organization is called the Center for Collective Wisdom, C4, the number 4, CW. And I think the email or the website is c4cw.org. Did I remember that correctly? Okay, book that's coming out is Living Collective Wisdom. If you can't wait, I highly recommend The Power of Collective Wisdom and the Trap of Collective Folly. Great read. John, if somebody wants to reach you, what's the best way to find you?
Email would be easiest, and they can find me through the website and would welcome any conversation that someone wants to initiate.
Absolutely. Thank you, John. What a delightful conversation, and what a privilege to call you a friend.
Likewise, Wanda. Always a delight.
Join us next week for another episode in Getting Out of Your Comfort Zone.